It really is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this afternoon's session on intellectual property. I am Angela Russell. I'm the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce in South Africa, and AmCham is the leading authentic voice and advocate for US businesses in South Africa, promoting mutual economic prosperity. And today's AmCham, our Intellectual Property Business Summit, is very important. The aim is for us to align business on this very critical issue. It's not only during these trying times of the pandemic, but also we need to look at it towards the future of the country and for all of our citizens. Partnering on intellectual property is important for us, especially within the development and sustainability of the country. And this is very important through areas such as agriculture, intellectual property, medicines, to name a few. And really what we want to do is have a conversation here. It really is my pleasure to welcome Tyler Crowe from the Global Innovation Policy Center, as well as all of our esteemed panelists who will be here to discuss this very important issue. So Tyler, I don't have your CV. Maybe you can just do a little intro for us and then we'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Angela, Annika, and the team at AmCham South Africa for this opportunity to participate on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Global Innovation Policy Center. As Angela said, my name is Tyler Crowe. I've been with the team for nearly 2 years here at GIPC, and I lead on our engagement on intellectual property policy in strategic and emerging markets, of which South Africa is one. I'm so excited for the opportunity to share with you all a bit more about our signature research product, the International IP Index, and also to put South Africa's score into context. Really appreciate again this opportunity to be with you all today, and I'm going to share my screen because I have a few slides. So bear with me for one moment and let me know if you don't see what I'm going to show. Okay. So you all should be able to see my screen now, is that right?
We can.
Very good. Thank you so much. So I know there is a lot to cover today, so let's get started. So first, what is the International IP Index? Well, it is a dynamic report in which policymakers and the general public can better understand the intellectual property regime of a particular market and also compare them against other markets in a particular development class or in a particular region. The IP Index began in 2012, examining 11 economies across 25 indicators, and my has it grown since then. This past year, when it was released in March 2021, our most recent edition included 53 economies across 50 indicators. And the reason why it has grown so much is truly the fact that IP systems are complex and they are evolving. We have expanded the total number of indicators to include 9 categories of IP protection, from the real nuts and bolts of what makes well-functioning IP systems, such as patents, copyrights, and trademark protections, to some newer aspects of IP that are just as important, such as design rights, trade secrets, and market access disciplines, commercialization of IP assets, enforcement, systemic efficiency, and ratification of international IP treaties. Each indicator across these 50 indicators that I mentioned is given equal weight. And so countries can score values between 0 and 1 for a total possible score of 50 points. I should note that it's hard to get a perfect score on the IP index. There isn't one economy that does. The closest economy that does come to that point is the US, which I believe scores in around the 90th percentile. More importantly about the IP index is that it is a living and breathing document. And so we encourage participation with the governments that are measured as part of it. If there is publicly available data that a government is willing to share with the researchers that prepare this report, Pugac Concilium, we highly recommend that they do that. In the past, that has actually brought about significant changes in a country's score. So if there are legislative updates, if there is, say, customs reporting data to help give our team a better idea of what the nature of enforcement actions has been in a particular year, that is super helpful. And so we actively encourage continued engagement and conversation with embassies here in Washington, and also with teams that are dedicated to working on intellectual property issues in Capital. So moving on to a bit more discussion about what the different indicators mean. Generally, they examine, as you can see on the slide, the term of protection, scope of protection, and mechanisms which allow rights holders to effectively utilize that protection. And what that means is that it captures truly the essence of a well-functioning IP system that balances the administration of IP rights, the use of those rights, and also the enforcement of those rights when they're taken advantage of. And so for that reason, each part of an indicator in the report is either binary, numerical, or mixed. I should note that most of the indicators in the IP index are what are called mixed indicators. And I'll give you an example of what that means. So in category 9, we measure international IP treaties. You can score a point on a particular indicator. A half point is given when a country accedes to an international IP treaty that's measured by the IP index, and another half point is given when that treaty is ratified into its domestic legislation. This is a really important and point-rich category, and it poses particular importance to the continued success of the South African IP regime. So we'll get into that a little later in the presentation. So what were some key findings from the 2021 IP Index? Namely, I feel, and this is really the coolest part about the IP Index this year, is that countries more and more are seeing the benefits of a strong IP system to the continued success of their national economy and workforce. In this past year, 32 of 53 economies improved their scores. And since 2014, the aggregate score has improved by 6.24%. So it really bears out in the numbers that countries and governments are doing more on intellectual property policy to make sure that their economies are capturing the benefits of a strong IP system, like I said, for their companies and for their workers. One other important trend to note here is that trade agreements played a particularly important role this past year in improving the national IP frameworks in some key markets. So for instance, as part of the US-China agreement, China received the largest overall increase in score, which is around 4%, whereas Mexico, as part of its relatively high standard USMCA commitments, saw an increase of 3.87% in its score. And for that reason, Mexico is the highest ranking country in the entire Latin American region, namely because of the high standard IP chapter in the USMCA. Some interesting findings that I'd also like to mention from the year prior in 2020 was that of Vietnam, which saw its score increase by nearly 6% due to its adoption of international IP treaties. Meanwhile, Peru also saw its score increase by about 5.9%. And this was due to really systemic and important changes that they made to its patent system, its copyright system, and its enforcement mechanisms. And I think that looking forward, when we get further into South Africa's performance on this year's IP Index, Peru might be an interesting model to consider going forward on South Africa's particular IP system. So I would be remiss if I did not mention the continuing impact of the global pandemic and the spread of COVID-19 around the world. Truly, this has been an opportunity in where the IP rules of our global system have been road tested like never before. And anecdotally, and truly, I mean, in my own experience even, IP has developed the treatments, vaccines, and cures that are being developed and released all over the world today. Novel mRNA vaccine technology was truly the result of decades of scientific research, and the private sector has played such an important role in the continued development and distribution of these treatments. Meanwhile, we note, a continuing conversation at the World Trade Organization on whether intellectual property policies are barrier to further access of these treatments and cures. And in the Chamber's view, undermining these intellectual property rights for complex and hard to manufacture vaccines would not solve this problem. It would not accelerate global production, and instead it would really hinder the ongoing and positive efforts to ensure that everyone around the world is vaccinated against this terrible disease. And I think that, within that context, it's important to, again, remember the importance of intellectual property policy in helping to set forth the rules of the road, ensuring that the right balance is struck to support the kind of investment that comes up with these kinds of mRNA technologies, while also helping on the back end to support workers and jobs and SMEs and large corporations as well in the economic recovery that we'll need when the pandemic is over and when we return to health. So let's look in detail now at South Africa's score as it relates to the other BRICS economies. You can see that there's a pretty widespread. China is the highest scoring BRICS economy at 54.86%, whereas South Africa at this point is the lowest scoring economy of that group at 36.61%. This is an important picture to look at here, simply because it will help to really put in context South Africa's overall score and help to figure out some of the challenges that the country is facing as it tries to improve its IP system in line with global best practices. So I'm going to show you next a really important graph that we're going to look at further on, which is South Africa's score in context. You'll see here the blue line represents South Africa's score against this matrix, whereas the yellow line shows the Africa and Middle East average. The red arrows that I've included here show particular categories in focus, and namely the membership and ratification of international treaties. South Africa actually performs well below the regional average. In addition, design rights as well, and also on some other sector-specific indicators and categories such as patents and trade secrets. Now, South Africa does overperform the region in indicators and categories for systemic efficiency, enforcement, and commercialization of IP assets. But to provide a good comparison across the BRICS economies, I chose Brazil, which is squarely in the center of the BRICS group. And we'll see right here the difference between a country like South Africa and Brazil. So you'll see that Brazil also has a relatively weak showing in the membership and ratification of international treaties, but its score is much higher. It ranks 42.32%, and that's mainly because it significantly outperforms the larger Latin American region in the systemic efficiency and design rights categories. And so I think as we continue on in the presentation here, you'll see a broader challenge that's facing South Africa in the IP space, which is that compared to other BRICS economies, it is the only one in nearly 8 years of data that has actually seen a decrease in score, which is around 2%. And so what are the reasons for this? It's largely due to the fact that it is relatively isolated from the international IP treaties that I showed earlier in Category 9. And it's also, in some of its domestic reform efforts, it has stalled or has really struggled to come up with high standard disciplines for intellectual property policy. And finally, despite the basic IP system that's in place in South Africa, as the IP index has added more indicators to capture a truly complex and diverse IP system, it shows that some of those really important ancillary categories and indicators are lacking in the overall framework. So let's look now at South Africa as it relates to the broader region in Africa and the Middle East. As the region goes in the IP index. So the other African economies that are measured are Kenya, Egypt, Nigeria, and Algeria. And as we saw earlier, South Africa's score as it relates to the IP index is among the lowest in the BRICS, and it really tracks more in line with the broader region in Africa. Interestingly enough, as you see, this red arrow here represents South Africa's score. There is an economy in the African region that scores above South Africa, and that is Kenya. For those of you who are counters, Kenya is above by about 0.64, which is nearly, I mean, it's a fraction of a point, but it's an important difference. And we'll see in the charts in the next few slides as to why that is. So looking again, this is a familiar chart for many of you that we had looked at before in the Brazil context. Some points that I'd like to show here. Again, we're pointing out the relative weakness compared to the overall region of membership and ratification of international IP treaties, and also some sector-specific deficiencies in, say, patents. Meanwhile, South Africa has a relatively strong showing in the systemic efficiency and enforcement categories. Meanwhile, in Kenya, you see a relatively stronger showing on the international IP treaty category, as well as in patents. You also see Kenya outperforms the region on copyrights and closely on trademarks. Kenya could be a much stronger performer on the IP index and really outperform South Africa even further if it improved on its enforcement and IP assets categories. And so that's certainly something to watch in the next few years as we continue on with this research. It's important to note that in 2020, which was the year in which we saw some of the largest growth among IP index economies, Kenya's score increased by about 4.2%, whereas South Africa's increased by about 2.06%. And I feel that this speaks to a broader trend, which is that in South Africa, what you have seen is a slower domestic adoption of important and high standard IP disciplines, and the continued disconnection from the international IP system, in where South Africa has ratified numerous international IP treaties, but it has not implemented them yet into domestic law. Meanwhile, in Kenya, it scores much higher in the category 9 international IP treaties. So that's a 3-point versus 1.5 difference between Kenya and South Africa. Meanwhile, on sector-specific categories in the index, you see that Kenya receives partial points for patent indicators 2, 3, 6, and 9, where South Africa does not receive any points for those. And what is really holding Kenya back in this context, again, is the weaker showing in enforcement and systemic efficiency categories. And this is where in the region you see South Africa outperforming. So before I close with my remarks, I want to basically ask the question of why are we here? Why am I here talking with you all about the importance of intellectual property protections? And as part of our IP index, we include what's called a statistical annex, which measures how IP can help to improve a country's socioeconomic indicators and environment. Countries that have strong IP protections are 38% more likely to attract venture capital. They're 24% more competitive and have 10% more clinical trial activity. Needless to say, in a COVID-19 environment, this has proven to make all of the difference in helping to develop the vaccines and treatments that we need to save lives. And it also, when the pandemic is over, will help to rebuild economies, not only here in the US, but in South Africa and elsewhere around the world. And so IP is so critical to ensuring the continued success of an economy, of country's small business sector, and a workforce. And so what might be the way for South Africa going forward on improving its overall IP norms and regime? So some brief recommendations, and I know that the panel later today will get into these a bit more, and I'm really excited to hear what the different sectors have to say. But one thing that I would start with would be focusing on South Africa's category 9. It currently receives a 1.25 point as part of a 7-point indicator. One thing that's notable here, some some IP treaties that were mentioned were the WIPO Internet treaties, for instance. South Africa acceded to this important instrument in 1998, and it has yet to implement it as part of its domestic law. And the Convention on Cybercrime, again, South Africa acceded to it in 2001, which is, as hard as it is to believe, I'm sure for many of us, 2001 was 20 years ago now, which is a long time. And so these are just basically things that have nearly already been done, but they are only waiting for domestic implementation. And one of the other things that I would mention about Category 9 is that it has the potential to affect South Africa's score in other indicators. So Indicator 13, which talks about collaborative means to fight online piracy, the Convention on Cybercrime might be able to do that and raise South Africa's score, which is currently at a 0.5. Category 8, systemic efficiency. As you saw in some of the earlier graphs, South Africa has a pretty strong showing on this when compared to the broader region, but it still scores around 2.5%. And so some of the things that go into the systemic efficiency category include things like coordination of IP enforcement across different agencies and government, educational campaigns that basically talk about the importance of IP and share that with the broader public, incentives for IP assets that SMEs have. I think that's particularly fitting given the fact that this year for World IP Day, we celebrated the importance of intellectual property for the continued success of SMEs, and also impact analysis, economic impact analyses on the importance of IP to a country's national economy. Indicator 8 is membership in a patent prosecution highway, and this was an indicator that Peru, as I mentioned earlier, had done with great success to help raise its score to the level that we had discussed. A patent prosecution highway is a way to help streamline patent administration in a country by leveraging work sharing agreements and technology. So I think we may get into that later in the session as well. Indicator 9 is patent opposition, another very important aspect of IP administration that bears further research and consideration for South Africa to implement as part of its IP system in line with global best practices. And Indicator 26, I mentioned barriers to market access because it helps to set the stage for another report that I recommend everyone to read if you have the opportunity. In 2019, GIPC and the US Chamber released a companion research report called the Innovation and Creativity Access Barometer, which talks about the nexus between IP protections and consumer access to important products like innovative biopharmaceutical products, creative content, and digital technologies. Now, we won't get into that here today, but I am happy to now conclude my presentation and see if there are any questions from the audience. Noting that, of course, if there's something that I can't answer right now, I would be happy to share my contact information and follow up with you later with some more information. So again, many thanks to you all for your attention during my presentation, and many thanks again to the AmCham team. Thank you so much.
Hi, Tyler. Thank you very, very much for that very in-depth and very interesting overview. I have learned so much just in terms of that brief period, and I've been researching extensively over the weekend just to ensure that I do this very crucial conversation justice. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Tyler, without further ado, I'm going to jump into the panel discussion with the panelists. So good afternoon to everyone joining us this afternoon. Allow me to extend my appreciation to Ms. Angela Russell, who is the CEO of AmCham South Africa, as well as her team for allowing us to actually host this very crucial session. And thank you to all the AmCham members and the listeners who have taken time out of your very busy day to join us. My name is Charmaine Houvet, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to moderate today's discussion. I'm also wishing everyone around the globe strength and added innovation as we celebrate the World Information Telecommunication Society Day. And interestingly enough, the theme for this year is accelerating digital transformation in challenging times, which I was reflecting on this weekend actually perfectly aligns today to today's conversation. I think Tyler expanded in the closing remarks, just in terms of how IP advances the country's socioeconomic environment. And I think this sets the foundation perfectly for the rest of the panel today, as we reflect on the topic, which is an analysis of the Global Innovation Policy Center of IP 2021. And we will actually unpack what this actually means for the various sectors that are actually represented here today. Our esteemed panel of speakers include Dr. John Purchase, who will actually unpack the upcoming questions from an agriculture perspective. And I think the CEO of AmCham highlighted the very crucial industries that we actually seen start to take the centerfold during this pandemic. We've got Mr. Bada Pharasi, who's actually going to be talking to us about the pharma industry, Mr. Thabo Mofokeng, who will unpack IT for us, and Ms. Chola Mahamate, who will actually look through the different aspects of copyright. I just want to ensure that all of our speakers are actually online. If everybody else, just for some housekeeping, could turn their audios off, and then once I call in a particular speaker just to unpack a particular sector a bit more, then we can actually ensure that only that speaker turns on the audio. So my first question, actually, I'm going to go over to Bada Pharasi. If I can just see your video, just so I know that you are online. Bada, please come up with your video. Perfect. There you are.
That's me.
That's you. Welcome, Bada. Please, if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, please correct me by all means, because I am Charmaine Houvet, and I've been called Charmaine Houvet. I've been called every other name under the sun, so please correct me.
Okay, when I lived in Zimbabwe, there were about 10 pronunciations of my last name, but the correct pronunciation is Pharasi.
Pharasi. Thank you very much. So thank you so much, Bada Pharasi. You are the Chief Operating Officer of Innovative Pharmaceutical Association of South Africa, and you were appointed in this position since August 2020, which I think was critical timing, especially with this pandemic. You've worked as a consultant in pharmaceutical policy for just under 3 years, and prior to working for about 14 years in the NGO sector, you've got extensive experience over 30 years dealing in pharmacy management, policy making, development, operational research, medicines legislation, and of course procurement. And it's interesting to see as well that you played a leading role, Mr. Pharasi, in terms of the development and implementation of South Africa's national drug policy, adopted in 1996 by the country's cabinet as the official policy. And you've also worked in public, private, and non-governmental sectors across South Africa. And you've also served as a member of the board of the Office of Health Standards Compliance, the Department of Health Pricing Committee, and as the president of the South African Pharmacy Council. And we also see that you've written and you've been published extensively. So maybe just in terms of biopharma, explain to us, I think Tyler mentioned in his remarks, as he was coming to the end of his discussion, he actually explained that there were certain indicators related to IP administration in South Africa, and he spoke about the patent prosecution highway. What is the process of getting a patent in South Africa? Because I've often heard from innovators, this is the most tiring and mind-boggling process ever. And what does a patent prosecution highway program do to improve the country's environment for innovators?
Well, having been involved initially in the development of the national drug policy back in the 90s, we obviously started looking at all sorts of factors that would influence mainly making medicines available to all our sectors and making them accessible and available at affordable prices. So therefore, one of the first things that we looked at was the issue of patents. And whereas we believed that the best way, at the time at least, The best way was to ensure that we made generic medicines more popular because they were cheaper. One soon realized that in order for us to have access to these generic medicines, you need to continue supporting the pipeline of innovation, of research and development that eventually leads to, once patents have expired, the population having access to those generic medicines. I must say at the time, and for a long time after that, what came to the fore was the fact that because of the myriad of policies or pieces of legislation that we had, which were not in sync with each other, it became extremely difficult for South Africa to be in a position where we could say we've made it easier for the implementation of patent laws. We are now in a position to say, not only are we able to invite international investment into our country and give those people who innovate the joy of knowing that their patents, their intellectual property is protected, we were not able to get to a situation where we could actually support our own industries, especially the startup entities, in ensuring that whatever innovations they came up with would be supported financially by government, working in collaboration with those international research and development companies present in the country that would be able to give them the support required to take that innovation all the way to the market. And much as people have been screaming and saying, implement the patent laws, unfortunately, they've been doing so for different reasons. Some people believe narrowly that implementing the patent laws would mean being able to usurp the patents, intellectual property of those who have spent billions and billions of rand in bringing those innovations to market. That's essentially what that would mean. And I think to some extent, what you say that it's a bit lazy. What we need to do in ensuring that we as a country eventually become self-sufficient in developing, in helping entities in the country become innovative, we do need to embrace those who come into our country with the patents, with intellectual property, use those, learn from them, get them at their own time, but without missing the fact that we really need to get to making the medicines available, give them the necessary support, and only in that way can we ensure that investment comes and stays in our country. Our laws often contradict one another, and we still need to get those in such a way. We need to get our ducks in a row, as they say. One of the realities is that much as people say, waive the IP laws, are we ready? If the IP laws were to be waived tomorrow, would South Africa be in a position to start producing the necessary vaccines and drugs? I think there's still a lot that we need to do. Importantly, what the community of science and medicines and healthcare in general in South Africa should note is the fact that the innovative pharmaceutical industry is ready to work with our government, with our scientists, to ensure that that is achieved.
And I think you make a valid point just in terms of ensuring that it's clear that we can't go at it alone. I think a very deep collaboration and partnership type approach is the only thing that is going to get us through to the finishing line. And I think you touched on some of the barriers that we actually do experience in terms of IP administration, and you've also touched on some of I guess, the barriers that are actually stifling the work of domestic innovators and even causing somewhat of a reluctance for more foreign investment to come into the country. So maybe just also expand a bit on that. And what do you think as governments who may be listening in, as private sector, as general citizens, what are some of the things that we can still start doing to get beyond these barriers?
I happen to have the opportunity to be part of a team that worked on, or that started to work on a biopharmaceutical sector policy development for South Africa about 3 or 4 years ago. Unfortunately, and through no fault of the team that was doing the work, it wasn't completed. But importantly, the fact that government decided to have that kind of policy developed showed that there was every intention on the part of our government to ensure that South Africa joined the rest of the global community in having the basics to ensure that we can also develop this. There's so much that stands us in good stead in terms of our disease patterns, the fact that we have among the best clinical trial facilities on this continent, and yet very little clinical trial development actually happens in this country. We don't make enough use of the facilities that we have in the country. Without really appearing to criticize government, I think we would need to have some kind of stability that ensures that regardless of the change in guard, regardless of one minister replacing another, we ought to have some permanency in the departments that have done so much work developing these policies to ensure that they do not just gather dust on the shelves, but that whoever comes in after the last person is able to continue with the good work that has been done. If you really look at some of the examples of the entities related to the scientific institutions of the country, the Medical Research Council, and many others, a lot of work is being done. What people do not have access to is the type of policy certainty, the financing, and ensuring that whatever they do is linked to international expertise that will help them take that to market. Those are among some of the things that we need to do. But importantly, we need to ensure that our public, everybody, understands exactly how it is that we have the vaccines and the medicines that today save so many lives. What goes into producing those? It's very, very important.
Got it. So I'm going to come back and circle back to you, Bada. I'm going to go over to Dr. John Purchase now. And Dr. John Purchase has been the CEO of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa since 2007. And he actually commenced his professional career as a scientist in South Africa's Agricultural Research Council, serving in various research and senior managerial positions for 22 years. And he's also served on the boards of the Land and Agricultural Bank of South Africa and the National Agricultural Marketing Council with distinction. Dr. Purchase currently serves as a trustee and chairman of the Maize Trust, and also serves as the chairman of the board of the South Africa Grain Information Services. And he's the business convener in the Trade and Industry Chamber of NEDLAC, and he's the deputy chairman of the Economic Council Committee of Business Unity South Africa. And he also serves as director of BUSA. And in terms of the current COVID-19 crisis, he leads the economic work stream within the COVID-19 response task team of the Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, Minister Toka Duziza, to ensure food security for all South Africans. And he's actually a recipient of a number of awards because of the remarkable work he actually does in this space. And I think the one that jumped out at me from his bio is that Dr. Purchase was honored by the French government, and he received the title of Knight of the Order of Agricultural Merit, which was bestowed on him by the French ambassador to South Africa for his services to agriculture and his services to agribusiness. So with such an impressive CV, Dr. Purchase, it's an absolute honor to have you join us here this afternoon. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Charmaine.
So maybe talk to us. Maybe explain to us, Dr. Purchase, how the agricultural producers use IP protections. And I guess, what is the nexus between other industries with us today, such as the innovative biopharma sector?
Yeah, thank you very much again for the invitation to Angela and her team, and good afternoon to all the participants. Obviously, the whole agricultural sector, I must just first put in context, is responsible for food security, and also in the pandemic, that was our big focus, was to ensure that we had food security, that all supply chains were not disrupted, that they were working, and that food inflation was kept under control, and food inflation was never above 5% until very recently, and that's only because of the spike of international prices. So we've done remarkably well. We've been blessed with good seasons too, but been remarkable how we could pull together to ensure food security in these tough and trying times. Now, one of the reasons for that is that we have a competitive agricultural sector in South Africa. We are a net exporter. We export roughly over $10 billion worth of agricultural products, primary, secondary. Now, that's quite a big number. That's close to 150 billion rands worth of product that we export. And we could only do that if we could be competitive in terms of our production practices, where we are using chemicals from multinationals that are patented, seed that's protected under the Plant Breeders' Rights Act. So all the IP that is protected in agriculture enhances our food security and our production. And so we are very strong believers in IP rights in the agricultural space. It goes very wide. It also goes into agricultural machinery and to many facets of the production system in agriculture. The one that is perhaps the most contentious is the issue of plant breeders' rights, and where our government has not always, if I may say so, played ball, and where we have perhaps undermined it from a policy perspective, and we have from time to time run into problems from a policy perspective on government on this. I mean, it was actually a big media story in the Mail and Guardian and others when we took them on around 2013, 2014 on the initial IP policy that's been revised since then. But these are the issues that we look at, that we engage on, to ensure that we do protect IP, and we do recognize the importance of IP in the broader agricultural and broader food sector. One of the most important ones that we're looking at now, and I did mention that, is Plant Breeders' Rights Act, originally from 1976. It's been amended a couple of times. It has just been amended again, and it's actually a new act that will come out. It's been assented now in 2018, but the regulations, it has not been implemented yet, and the regulations have not been tabled for private sector to comment on. So we are awaiting those regulations, and as we know, the devil is in the detail, and we've got to have a look at that, and then see that we comment constructively on what is proposed. So it obviously it is a space that we're looking with. Many of our members are multinationals, also American companies, and we look to protect their interests also in terms of this. But it's not just their interest, it's also the interest of our industry in the process, and that's the point I'm trying to make. And if you look after that, you will ensure food security, you will ensure that people have access to affordable food, and that is basically the mantra we use from the agricultural, or the agri-food sector, as I would call it.
And I think it's actually very interesting to actually, I think when we're listening to the numbers, like 150 million rands, that's huge. And I think often this is a sector, and especially when we look at 4IR technology and we look at the explosion in terms of agro processing, and you look at the markets that are rapidly developing, of course, this is one of those that are at the forefront. It's actually listed as one of the top 3 that will actually start to see how the country's economy starts to turn around. And then I'm wondering, and I think, Tyler also just mentioned a lot around looking at the enabling factors inside of a country and looking at their policies. How can greater use of IP-enabled innovations in the sector support South Africa's socioeconomic development? So you spoke about, the food security, greater food production, ensuring that we maybe maintain or even grow the level of exports for better resilience in terms of extreme weather, etc., etc. There are these really exciting developments developments that are underway. What are some of these that you actually see yourself and lots of members working towards?
Yes, I think there are many, as I indicated, many aspects to IP and technology in production, and not just in the production of food, but also in the processing and also up and down the value chain, from your input suppliers, your chemicals, your stock remedies, IP on technology, software, also in your machinery, etc. So the agricultural industry or the agri-food industry is a high-tech industry these days, and because of that, we need to protect that the IP in that sector. Yeah, it's 150 billion rands worth of exports that we have from our agricultural sector. It is very significant. Agro-processing already accounts for more than 25% of manufacturing output in South Africa. So we can see that the whole agri-food sector is absolutely at the core of the economic recovery. Last year we grew by 13%. We expect to grow by 5% this year. About the only sectors that are growing significantly in South Africa at the moment. And I think part of that is technology based. Let me put it that it's technology based. And that technology base and productivity basis is on the basis, in many cases, of IP, intellectual property, whether it's in plant varieties, whether it's in stock remedies, whether it's in chemicals, etc. All of them have a certain amount and different acts that protect them and under which they are registered. And it's because of those trademark acts, geographical indications, for example. I've just moderated a session with the European Union on geographical indications, which is a form of property rights protection. So there are many different aspects to intellectual property in the whole agro-food system. I can mention oodles of examples for you, but fundamentally, you've got to harness these to ensure your competitiveness on the global market, and that's your ability to sell your product at a price equal to or lower than the international price and still be profitable. And that is what we try to ensure from South African agri-food sector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Purchase. I'm going to come back to you, and I think you're making a very valid point just around the importance of IT as a whole. Thabo Mofokeng, who is an ICT professional and project manager specialist with extensive experience in broadband network systems design, development and engineering, maintenance and technology management, as well as regulatory environment infrastructure. And he's actually acquired in-depth knowledge of electrical supply transmission, information technology software solutions. He's the founder of Solario Technologies, which provides information technology solutions, technology management consulting services, as well as management services and engineering solutions. Thabo is the president of the IT Association of South Africa and serves as a board member of the Media Information and Communications Technology SETA. He's a qualified electrical engineer with the BSc in Electrical Engineering from Howard University in Washington, D.C., USA. Thabo, welcome. It's actually lovely to see you again and have you on board with us. Thank you for joining us today. I think Dr. Purchase made such a relevant comment just around the significant growth that's tied to ICT. And we saw, right, in the past year, we're 14 months into the pandemic, and each and every sector, regardless of what they do, has been touched by this global acceleration of the digital transformation of societies. Even today, our society is celebrating World Information Society Day. What was the role that IP protection played in ensuring the development of the technology? Maybe it hasn't. And also, how has it actually spurred on or strengthened the infrastructure that we have so heavily become reliant on during the era of the COVID pandemic?
Good day, Charmaine. It's a pleasure to meet again, and the panelists and everyone that has logged in to share some ideas with us. Charmaine, you're absolutely right. IT and telecoms as a foundation technology, if you like, for many of the changes that we are seeing globally. software in particular, we can see software pretty much right across all sectors. No sector is really spared from technologies and software developments taking place right across the world. South Africa as a whole does participate a lot more extensively. I'm going to make a slight distinctions between the telecoms environment and then the IT services environment, for the simple reason that globally and even within South Africa, it's relatively straightforward how the telecommunication environment is licensed and managed, the regulations related to that, and how government produce regulations that pertain to how various parties in the networking space provide services, whether it's fixed network services, wireless network services, as well as integrators in that environment. The pure IT services, which are generally software that runs on top of the hardware, and the hardware can be in data centers. The hardware can be in a localized computers. Today we're connecting using Teams. So you'll have to have a local software app that runs to a central server that could be in the cloud and in a data center. That is a lot more slightly fragmented and difficult from a government point of view to manage and to regulate. Because software by its very nature is pervasive, it's difficult to touch. You can see its impact, you can feel its impact. It does assist in running all sorts of technology-focused environment. Today we are in an environment where we find financial services, for example, are not spared. The influence of technology, we're seeing situations where not only governments can now produce currencies, the fintech environment is exploding. So the IT services space, it's a lot more fragmented, but more influential, and companies can run over-the-top services on top of cloud environment like you have at Cisco, you have at AWS or Microsoft or Google for that matter. So the networking space generally is pretty much straightforward and simple to manage, control, regulate, and implement government-related services and taxation. It becomes a different ball game if you're going to buy a book from Amazon Web Services. You could be downloading the book from Ireland. The question becomes now, where does, from a geographic point of view, where should your taxation reside? And I know South Africa has made some improvements in terms of getting taxation insofar as where the product gets consumed. However, software as it is, you could basically consume services from anywhere across the world. As a matter of fact, the world has become such effectively a global village. The world has become small. The world is accessible. You could access the world literally from your desktop, your laptop, your handset, your tablet, any means of communications globally. So in a nutshell, from patent protection for equipment manufacturers, original equipment manufacturers, the likes of Cisco, Huawei, Nokia, that provides a telco kit and the telco processing equipment, the central cloud services equipment. Those are generally regulated under a process called type approval systems, where the hardware itself gets authorized for utilizations within a South African space. So that becomes a little bit more straightforward because IPASA generally, every equipment, the handsets, any equipment that transmit using wireless communication infrastructure, even fixed communication infrastructure. So your point of call there would be the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa that provides the regulation. However, the laws would be processed via the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies. So once more, there is better clarity on the big kids, big networks, big services. The invisible stuff, the software part, there you have a challenge because you've got multinationals that are big, you've got local companies that operate globally, and you also have South African companies that provide services internationally. That area is a little bit more difficult for governments, and not only South African government, but global countries and governments. We've seen recently with in the United States, for example, it's difficult to manage and control fintech. You may get one currency being recognized as a currency in one country. And I'm talking here about virtual currencies. Whereas in the US, you might have about 3 different regulatory bodies. South Africa is not yet mature to regulate extensively over-the-top services like fintech, as well as the other services that are available for us. And I will pause there, Shamin. Thanks.
And I think it's an important point you're actually making, Thabo, just around capacity and resources. And I mean, we see it all the time. A new policy, a new regulation pops up. We saw the whole, debacle that happened around government trying to post facto try and regulate the entire Uber industry and trying to instill policy and force that. It becomes difficult at a time. And I think similarly with the entire process when it comes to software, do you think that, around IP protections, that so maybe how does legal certainty of IP protection support greater investments in South Africa, or how do they encourage digital acceleration? Because again, I think there's a very fine line of trying to regulate everything when you made a very valid point just around how do we ensure that there are resources to effect such. And we even saw it with the type of approval you're speaking about. We went through lots of sort of hurdles before we finally settled in with the regulator.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Shamin. Look, IP protections generally, because South Africa is effectively a signatory to international bodies, examples like ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. Hence, today we are participating in the International Telecoms and Information Society Day. South Africa has been a strong participant, particularly on the development components of ITU. And then with alignments to the likes of European ETSI, IPASA, for example, does have collaboration engagement with the likes of Federal Communications Commission in the USA, as well as a lot of our networks and some of the bigger service providers being members of the GSM Association. So these are international global organizations that assist in terms of harmonizing IP immersion and protection across the world. So, but how do we protect those standards? Usually the court would be the last point of call in terms of getting a proper arbitration where there are warring factions. But it's fair to say that IPASA generally has done a relatively good job in terms of providing regulations. Where we as a country have generally slacked down and to some extent have failed to deliver on our promises would be scenarios like the switch off of analog TV as an example to make available more spectrum for services that require high bandwidth. As a country, I think we also have failed to provide services to the needy at an affordable cost. I'm sure, Shamin, as part of the 4IR Commission, you would have picked up a lot of disparities. Again, the digital divide, unfortunately here we have to be honest, it keeps expanding. The government's role would have been to try to bridge that digital divide. as things stands, we have not made great strides in ensuring that that digital divide is improved or is lessened. By the same token, education is key to ensuring that there is skills transfer. Now, the absence of skills transfer means you've got an increasingly bigger body of students who ultimately becomes adults who become less inclined to understand technologies, sometimes not out of their choice. It could be out of lack of access to high-tech communication devices, lack of access to computing devices, lack of access, and even exposure to computers. So the end result, you end up having a larger body of people that are not getting even the basic understanding of how to use computing to advance themselves. Gauteng, for example, does have a Department of e-Government whose intention is to provide access to schooling communications to support schools in terms of getting access to more affordable bandwidth. But you can only do that when you are in classrooms or at school. Once you are off a school environment, it's another challenge. Computing devices are also expensive. But yes, overall, government through the Department of Communications and Digital Technology is the custodian of making rules, laws, and effectively regulations via IPASA that the industry has to conform to. But also implementing some of these changes have got their own challenges. We have seen recently with the government attempting to bring in a wireless open access network. And then there is legal challenges on the other end from the likes of Telkom and MTN and even ETV for a variety of reasons. The end result of having these contesting parties means that we increasingly become left behind globally in terms of being technically ahead of the game. That's why you get the likes of Rwanda as an example and Kenya. In many instances, leapfrogging South Africa in terms of provision of true and high bandwidth for access to schools and universities as well as the industries. Thanks, Shami.
Got it. Perfectly put, Thabo. I think you've encapsulated it so perfectly, and this is a key point of discussion today with the ministry and with various of the sector who are participating in World Information Technology Society Day. And I think when you have 21 million of your citizens unconnected, it is a dire concern. And I think, if anything, the COVID-19 pandemic has further reflected and revealed to us that the digital divide is indeed real. And I think you're spot on. I think you're right. I think there are pockets of excellence when it comes to the regulator, the policymaker, in terms of bringing the sector along. And I think there are other times when there is limited consultation, now resulting in the delay of handing over of that spectrum since 2016. There has been a big gap, and instead the situation keeps, actually spiraling out of control. So well put. I'm going to come to you now, Chola Mahamate, who is the General Manager for Legal Services and Licensing Administration at the South African Music Rights Organization. Chola attended the Wits University in Johannesburg, where she graduated with BCom, LLB, and LLM degrees, and subsequently worked as a consultant on and managed projects involving multilateral organizations, provincial and local government. Chola is an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa and practiced law at one of the leading law firms in South Africa. She was also the CEO of Downtown Music Hub, a non-profit company established by the Department of Arts and Culture to deal with some of the challenges in the South African music sector. And Chola is also currently serving as the Secretary of the Copyright Coalition of South Africa. So it's actually great to have you on board, Chola. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Charmaine, and thank you to Angela and the team, and also to Tyler for the very insightful presentation. I think just to start off, I like to say when we're talking about copyright, and I think copyright as it pertains to, in particular, the creative industries, in the family of IP, I think we're that sibling that no one can really describe. We're an unknown quantity. I think the others you can say is a doctor or a lawyer, easy to relate to, but copyright and copyright in the creative industries is something else. Niche area in the IP family, but also very complex, and I think requires a lot of understanding in terms of the value, if understood and utilized and operationalized properly, it could add generally, I think, to the South African economy, the world economy, and just in terms of developing culture and how it shapes and forms societies and countries, and also just to say, South Africa in particular has had a long and difficult, sometimes difficult history with property in general, whether it be incorporeal and corporeal property. But with corporeal property, it's easy to understand. You've got land, you know what needs to be done there, you know what the fight is, you know what the parameters are. Incorporeal is quite difficult because it's intangible. And copyright is one of those things. Again, compared to its siblings, the rules of the game are not always very clear. In fact, even for myself, who's been dealing with copyright for a while, sometimes you get to a point where you think you understand, but you actually don't, because as you delve further into it, it becomes a little bit more complex. And I think this conversation is very timely because we're currently in the process of amending our Copyright Act. It's a 1978 piece of legislation. So as you can imagine, very old. It has not taken into account what's been happening in the world from a digital perspective and other perspective, and it needs to be brought into this decade really, and quite quickly, because things are happening on a daily basis. There's disruption happening everywhere. There are changes that are happening everywhere, and we need to be agile enough, not just with legislation, but in different ways to adapt to that, so that we can take advantage of the opportunities that are presented to us as a country in the IP space. I think one important point that Tyler did make in his presentation is around our isolation in terms of international treaties. We are a player in that space, and we've signed some treaties, but we haven't domesticated them, which creates its own challenges when you also have a very outdated piece of legislation. Things like the digital treaties, which ensure further protection for performers, ensure further protection for authors. Things like the Marrakesh Treaty, which allow access to the visually impaired to different types of published materials. We need to be able to do that and domesticate those types of things, because then you're able to provide a minimum level of protection to your rights holders in this country, and you're also then able to give them the opportunity to make money from their works, because the whole thing about copyright is that it applies across the board in the creative industry to different types of sectors. So, it would apply, for instance, to music, it would apply to audiovisual, to film and television, it would apply to the visual arts, it would apply to book publishing, it would apply to animation, even IT to some extent, agriculture to some extent. So there's wide-ranging ways that copyright is applicable, but obviously my focus is on the creative industry. And within each sector, for instance, when you produce a song, or when you write a composition, from that one work, you have what we call a bundle of rights that accrue to that work. And in that bundle of rights, you as a creator are then able to earn a living from each one. So you could find that I could compose a song and I could have 8 revenue streams from that one song, and able to make a living from that one particular composition. But because we don't have an understanding, I think, which is one of the issues that we need to tackle, is that there isn't an understanding of copyright in of itself, and the rights landscape and the way different rights accrue to different works, and therefore subsequent revenue streams. Our people in this country are not able to take advantage and make money from copyright, which is a huge problem, a big hole that we need to have. Another thing, like I said, because we have this outdated legislation, we haven't domesticated international treaties, we are unable, for instance, to make money from particular rights. Take, for example, communication to the public, or making available, or able to expand from distribution, reproduction, etc. So that limits the ability for individual rights holders, firstly, to be protected, secondly, to be able to make money. And if they can't, as individuals, make money because of how copyright is structured, it's usually, one-man shows, two-lady shows who are creating employment. That limits the ability to have the rand circulating locally, and it limits the ability also to then export and be appropriately protected in other jurisdictions. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that copyright space. Now, coming to the legislation, it has been, and this is a point that Tyler made as well, it has been a very long process to even get us to a point now, actually, even the last week, where Parliament decided to accept the reservations the president had about the Copyright Amendment Bill, one of them being its constitutionality, and some other issues around exceptions, arbitrary deprivation of property, etc. That is now, the parliamentarians decided that they agreed with his reservations, and that's now further delayed the process of that legislative amendment. And I think part of the reasons why it's taken so long, like I've said, is there's a lack of understanding of copyright because of our long, painful history with copyright protection, the protection of indigenous knowledge systems. I think the knee-jerk reaction is to try and put together legislation that is responding to something, but it doesn't necessarily have to sit in the legislation, which then will create a bigger problem going forward. And then another knee-jerk reaction is to import things from other jurisdictions, which makes sense in their jurisdiction because they have years of jurisprudence to rely upon, and they have a particular context within which they operate, and they don't have to deal with the same things that we deal with locally, but we just transplant. And then when we transplant, we don't look further to see, but hang on, like Tyler said, are there extra measures in there that will act as a counter to whatever it is that you're bringing in? But we just take the one part and don't look at the other. So what you end up having is a mishmash of legislation that is not fit for purpose and doesn't make sense, and will ultimately be subject to constitutional challenges, litigation and the like, and won't benefit rights holders and ultimately the economy in the country. So that's, those are part of the reasons why this process has taken so long. And another thing as well is that because copyright is niche but broad at the same time, the impact of amending that legislation will be felt differently across the board in sectors and across the board in provinces, because, like I said, you have these indigenous knowledge systems that operate differently depending on where in the country you are, and you need to take that into account. And that's why you need to do things like economic impact assessment studies to understand what impact the legislation will have, on the sectors, on different cultures, on trade. Those sort of things need to be done. So for me, we're sitting here with a golden opportunity where we can actually draft or have a bill that's drafted that is fit for purpose, will meet the needs as required for rights holders, and also have the balance in terms of access to those works for users, and can also be a driving force, in contributing to the GDP in this country. I mean, before COVID, the South African Cultural Observatory did a study, because also that's another thing, data in the creative industry is something that's hard to come by. For instance, we can't really value what the contribution of IP is in the creative industries. In 2018, 2017, 7% of all jobs came from the creative industries. And before COVID, I think that was on a rise. But now we need to see what impact COVID has had on the creative industries and ultimately the economy as a whole, because I think cultural exports is one of the ways that we can really grow this economy. In order to do so, you need legislation that's fit for purpose and that allows and creates an enabling environment for that balance to be kept between creating works and the access to those works. Thank you.
I actually love the whole guidance that's suggested around the economic impact assessment, because I think for too long, we were not in that space where we actually encourage government to actually adopt this. And you're spot on. You are so right that there's always this knee-jerk reaction to regulate it, put it in a policy, and that should fix the broader problem, which is not always going to be the case. So I actually really like that guidance. So well done. I also, and I think, again, now that you've explained the different streams of income that are available for the different sectors, now we understand why piracy is such a big issue in the country and why it limits so many of the creative industries. And again, it's this awareness and education and the impact analysis that must be done, because very often we don't always come to that point of understanding what the true issues are.
No, you're right. And when you speak about piracy, I think I was chatting to someone the other day when a lot of people think about piracy, you know, in the old days when they used to have these campaigns and they would have piles of CDs and other counterfeit goods, just put in a pile and then light a fire or whatever. But the depiction of piracy was that physical CDs or tapes or whatever the case may be. But now we have a more complicated form of piracy because you have to deal with the digital environment and how that's impacted and how that breaks the chain between somebody creating a work and actually earning something from those works, and how that is actually disrupting that entire value chain. So that's something that I don't think has been thought about. I think at some point piracy was a true buzzword and there was a lot of focus on it. But I think with the complication of the digital age and the internet, and enforcement and capability around that, I think that's something that needs to be brought back into the spotlight.
Absolutely. So very valid point. So I'm going to go back again, maybe just to the first speaker. Let's come back to you, Mr. Pharasi, and maybe you can just give us some closing remarks, just in terms of top of mind thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners just before, maybe a minute or two in terms of closing remarks.
Thank you, Charmaine. Now, given that the end result of this whole interaction between business and government is intended collaboration that will ensure that everybody, business and government, are on par as far as the attitude towards intellectual property is concerned. And the first thing that I would like to say that points towards that being successful is the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic brought about unprecedented levels of collaboration between South Africa's corporate sector and the government. And that was for the supply of personal protective equipment, diagnostics, and other medical devices, and eventually the well-needed vaccines. We know that the entire world has been looking up to the innovative pharma industry to come with quick solutions as far as that is concerned, vaccines and therapeutics. Now, in the area of intellectual property specifically, we are aware of the presence in this space of independent nonprofit organizations dedicated to increasing awareness of the positive impact of intellectual property on people's lives and working to bring about increased collaboration between the private and public sectors. Now, one could say, well, you could see, they could be seen, these independent IPOs, as neutral parties who could act as a kind of watchdog. That's not a very nice word to use, but yes, a kind of watchdog, for lack of a better word, to monitor progress in the implementation of international treaties. IPASA is fully aligned with the efforts aimed at fostering meaningful partnership on IP between the government and the business sector. So as IPASA, viewing our Association of Innovative Medicines Manufacturers as an integral part of the healthcare landscape of our country, we commit our member companies to this partnership. And when we say this, we take into account the fact that many of us who are involved in this industry are not just employees and representatives of the multinational industry. We are South African first and foremost, and we do understand the important role these companies, this industry brings into the livelihoods and lives of South Africans. And we need to ensure that everybody in the country does the best they can to ensure that this partnership is successful. We indeed support the efforts at bringing together this partnership. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much for that. Dr. John Purchase, some closing remarks from you?
Yes, thank you very much, Charmaine. I've been very intrigued listening to all the panelists and especially also to Tyler for his contribution in terms of the International Property Rights Index. What worries me is that I have the 2019 IPRI index with me, and there we were above all the BRICS countries. Now we're below all the BRICS countries. We've also dropped from over 60% to around 40%. So there's a clear deterioration in how we are viewed in terms of maintaining property rights and respecting property rights. I've also looked at the the phase 1 IP policy from government. And I think where the problem comes in is bullet number 3 in terms of policy objectives, where it says ensuring an appropriate balance between IP protection to encourage innovation on the one hand, and the dissemination of the benefits of innovation for society. And then it says balancing the rights of owners and users of IP. And I think somewhere we are missing each other here between ourselves and government, private sector and government. And this is at the core, fundamental to what we should be doing. That's why this debate is incredibly important. And I think government are making a mistake. I'm going to be very frank about this. I've said this before, and I was lambasted in the media, so if they want to lambaste me again, they're welcome. But I think we are making a mistake by not protecting IP sufficiently and encouraging and stimulating innovation, using that in terms of our competitiveness and building our economy. And I think this is fundamentally where we need a stronger debate also with government. So I think I'm going to close with those remarks. I would like Tyler to do a research project on how our IP rights and the protection of them have been viewed over time, how it has deteriorated over time. I think those facts and figures we need to put to government, and I would request him to do that. Thanks very much for the opportunity. It's been stimulating.
Thank you so much, Dr. Purchase. And again, I think our extreme gratitude has to be extended to the American Chamber of Commerce and the team for actually setting up such a vital discussion. Again, even for me, who's been in the sector for decades, like close to 35 years, you know, this is a topic that you're so right. We very seldom actually sit down and expand and unpack. And I think Tyler was just phenomenal, just in terms of even just providing me with just the flow of the conversations and going through his presentation this weekend. And there I agree with you that I think in other instances, government is always open and available to discuss and debate these issues. And I think for a conversation as important as IP, this is something where we are going to lean very heavily on AmCham, where they have the opportunity to actually lead in this space because nobody else is. So thank you very much for those comments. I truly appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So over to you, Thabo, for your closing remarks and just guidelines.
Shamin, I think thanks again for the stimulating discussion. And thanks to both GIPC and AmCham for bringing this matter to our attention, because key performance indicators are very crucial in terms of assessing the country and ourselves as to where we are at any given time. It does wake us up to realize that, hey, we are actually not where we should be. As it's quite clear right now that South Africa is punching below its weight, which is quite unfortunate. But then it does raise the issue again that as a country, we need to essentially improve ourselves. And obviously with KPIs, we're able to measure, you're able to track these sorts of statistics coming every year. And then every year, you know whether you have improved from previous years and so on. Generally, on the issue of patent protection, it is essential because we are in a globalized world. And you've got to incentivize those that create unique solutions to the world's problems and protect their patents. And as a country, we need to start taking more action towards protecting intellectual property. Collaboration and partnerships, I think one key area that organizations like ITA can play a big role is in terms of assisting and working with government to bridge the gap between creation of laws and regulations and implementations of those. Because implementations talks a lot about how you respect the other party's IP, how you can utilize it to even solve our local problems. But it is fundamental that we respect IP, we work together with the international partners, and we also create our own IP that we can sell. Because these things are reciprocal. We can't expect to violate international IPs at the same time we want our IPs to be protected. So through collaborations, partnerships, and bringing to our attention these global indexes, it does help us in terms of preparing, planning, and doing an introspection on ourselves as to where we are in the global village. Thanks, Charmaine.
Thanks so much, Thabo. Very valid point. And again, I think I like the guidance just around using these platforms and various other association platforms to start to engage government in this regard, because I think it's quite critical that we don't only look after the domestic space, but I think the president is on this huge investment drive to start to encourage a lot of multinationals and external players to come and invest in the country, but then we have to also ensure that we offer the right protection to companies who are coming in to genuinely and ethically invest in our countries. And then again, not everything can be legislated, not everything finds its way in a policy. And again, I think, as Dr. Purchase was saying, these engagements and the awareness and the education, again, is so crucial. So thank you very much for that, much appreciated. I'm going to end with you, Chola, some closing remarks and reflections from you, please.
Thanks, Charmaine. I think for me, look, I think, as I said earlier, this is a golden opportunity, particularly with the information that we have. You know, it's a wise person who takes this on board and actually internalizes it and looks at a way to improve, because there's some low-hanging fruit that we can take advantage of given the data that we've been provided with today. And I think a partnership with government to look at these issues is critical, because I think the resources are there to assist. And I think in a lot of instances, people are willing to give of their time to assist where they can, just to plug the gap. So I think in terms of that, I think the way that is provided or that is offered, that should be taken with both hands. And I think also another thing, an area of introspection for government, and I might get into trouble for this, is somewhat slightly schizophrenic in their approach to things, because you will be trying to enact a piece of legislation which, for instance, puts your participation in something like AGOA in jeopardy, but you're the same department. You can't do things like that. You know, you need to look at things holistically and the impact that it will have. For instance, now copyright is at the center of the discussion and could be impacting on your trade relations. You need to be able to look at what your actions are doing and how they're impacting you elsewhere, and have a holistic approach to policy, to legislation, and to whatever other interventions are there. And I think in particular for our country, I think one of the other issues that Tyler mentions, that education awareness is critical around IP, regardless of whether it's patents, copyright, trademarks. Those things are critical, because you need people to be able to operate within the system and utilize the system to move the needle. Otherwise, you have so much untapped potential sitting in a country which could be moving forward in various different ways. So for me, there's just a lot of opportunities to be taken advantage of. And I think collaboration is key. These types of platforms are critical, because then you have discussions and your eyes are opened up about things that you never really thought about before. So I think just thank you to Angela and her team, and also Tyler for his presentation, and you for some excellent facilitating.
Thank you very much, Chola. And somebody's actually commenting that absolutely spot on in terms of AGOA access risk. And then again, I think it's so important for us to figure out, how do all of these different dots connect? How do we ensure that they are joined in the end, so that one is actually not detrimental to the other? And again, I think what's crucial is for everyone who's listening in, who's joined in, led by AmCham, and again, extending our appreciation to the team at GIPC to ensure that this enlightenment and this education and awareness is actually driven to ensure that at the end of the day, all of the parts come together. So thank you very much to Tyler Crowe for the amazing presentation, and for actually setting the scene for the rest of the presenters. Thank you very much to the presenters who actually joined us. Yeah, they all are up here. And from me, Charmaine Houvet, thank you very much for allowing me to moderate such an insightful and enlightening conversation. I now hand over to you, Ms. CEO of AmCham, Ms. Angela Russell. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charmaine, and thank you for such a beautiful moderation. And really big thank you to all of the participants. I mean, it was quite interesting looking at how this impacts different sectors, you know, going from one and moving to another. I think it was very interesting just seeing, you know, the impact across all the various things. But I think really what it is following on today's session, what we would like to do is take this partnership that was established here a little bit forward. And what we're planning to do is host an event either in July or August this year with the Ministers of Health, Science and Technology, as well as the trade industry and competition in the form of a ministerial summit. We are still looking at the dates. We're still waiting for confirmation from the ministers, and we really will be communicating this with you. But what the plan for us going forward from here is to crystallize some of these key points on business positions and share them with you. And then what we would like to do is, you know, ask you, please, you know, feel free to send us additional information. We will then circulate this to you for further input, and we'll reach out to you as soon as we know when this ministerial summit is, so that you can actively participate on that as well. We really would like to thank you. I think it's been exceptionally interesting across all of the various industries. I think it is such a critically important topic for us to have conversations on and see how we can ensure, you know, the success of the South African economy. And from there, I'm going to say thank you very much. Thank you, Tyler, and to all of our panelists. It was really enlightening. So we shall be in contact with you, and please, you know, feel free to reach out to us with any issues or anything that you would like to add it onto this business position. So from there, maybe some thumbs up if you're good with that, and then I will invite you to enjoy the rest of your afternoon. So thank you very much for everyone for joining. And then Annika has put her email address up for you.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Angela. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks and cheers.
Thank you very much.